Hey everybody, this is the introduction and the stuff at the beginning of Marxism, Last Refuge of the Bourgeoisie, by Paul Mattick, edited by Paul Mattick Jr. I don't know how much of this book I'll actually get to, but I just wanted to read the introduction, because that's fun. This book is from what year? 1983. It starts off with a quote. Quote, bourgeois class rule fights its last battle under a false flag, under the flag of revolution itself. End quote. Rosa Luxemburg. To the memory of Marinus van der Lubbe. If you don't know who Marinus van der Lubbe was, he was kind of like someone who I think was somewhat on the outskirts of like the left communist and anarchist milieu in Germany, who eventually burned down the Reichstag. There's always debate about did the Nazis really burn down the Reichstag, but I think it's pretty much, it's the historical consensus is that it was Marinus van der Lubbe. Kind of a lone, but it was like a lone wolf attack, like desperation. Contents. Forward by Paul Mattick Jr. Marxism and Bourgeois Economics. Revolution and Reform. Marxism and Bourgeois Economics. And the sections of that are Introduction, Value and Price, the Transformation Problem, Value and Capital, Theory and Reality. Part 2 of the book is titled Revolution and Reform, Introduction, Capitalism and Socialism, Reform and Revolution, The Limits of Reform, Lenin's Revolution, The Idea of the Commune, State and Counter-Revolution, The German Revolution, Ideology and Class Consciousness. And the final section is titled Marxism, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. And that's also what the last chapter is called. Marxism, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. So I'm going to read the foreword by Paul Mattick Jr., and then I'm going to read the introduction to Marxism and Bourgeois Economics, that part of the book. The present book, Paul Mattick's last writing, was unfinished at his death in February 1981. I have included as a final chapter an essay written in 1978 that summarizes the theme of the book, but it may still be useful to introduce these pages with a few words on the projected whole of which they were to be part. On the manuscript title page, Paul wrote, quote, a summing up, a summon up, end quote. Marxism, Last Refuge of the Bourgeoisie, was to be a final statement of a lifetime's reflection on capitalist society and revolutionary opposition to it, arguing that Marxism, as a critique of political economy, could be of service to the development of bourgeois theory and practice only if emptied of its essential content. Paul answers the question in his title with a clear no. For this reason, the book is also a summons to action, since Marxism's comprehension of modern society, the only alternative so far to that society's failed attempts to understand itself, implies the necessity of active opposition to the system of wage labor in all its forms. Marx's analysis of capitalist society was neither an economic nor a political theory. Instead, by showing that bourgeois politics is dominated by economic questions, and that the latter are only the ideological representation of social class relations, Marx demonstrated the limits inherent in both sets of categories, the political and the economic, for the explanation of social reality. The workers' movement against capitalism, he showed, would have to abolish both capital and the state, replacing, quote, economics and, quote, politics with the self-organization of the, quote, free and associated producers, end quote. Since Marx's time, however, the two aspects of his unified critique of politics and economics have been represented by different individuals and political currents. The Stalinist Henrik Grossman, for example, was the major figure in the rediscovery of Marx's critique of economics. That's cool that he says it plainly. The Stalinist Henrik Grossman, for example, was the major figure in the rediscovery of Marx's critique of economics, while Rosa Luxemburg, who understood this critique imperfectly, developed Marx's theory of the socialist movement as working-class self-organization. Paul Mattick alone in our time recombined these strains into an analysis of the many-sided process that constitutes the capitalist mode of production. Moreover, the various organizational forms and ideological expressions of the Marxist movement have been part of the unfolding of this mode of production. He saw that the Marxist critique must be extended also to them. This book, extraordinarily, was envisioned in 4 basic parts. The first centers on a restatement of the fundamentals of the Marxian critique of political economy, with special attention to those aspects of Marx's theory, the labor value analysis of price, and the empirical validity of the theory that have been the main points at once of bourgeois attack and of Marxist writers' retreat into bourgeois economic analysis. The second part traces the history of the main forms of the Marxist political movement, social democracy and Bolshevism, to show how adoption of the structures of bourgeois politics has implied the abandonment of both socialist practice and Marxian theory. A third section, unwritten, would have explored recent attempts on the part of economists, radical and otherwise, to overcome the ever more visible bankruptcy of their discipline by integrating elements of Marxism into it. In Marxism and Keynes, Paul had already shown the failure of an earlier form of this attempt, in the realm of theory as well as in that of political economic policy. In the present work, the argument was to be extended to, quote, post-Keynesians and, quote, neo-Ricardians and, quote, Marxist economic, end quote, theory. The final section of the book would have returned to its starting point, the restatement of the basic principles of Marxism, with an analysis of the meaning of socialist revolution at the present time. Here Paul intended to discuss both forms of revolutionary action and the nature of the post-revolutionary social organization, a system of workers' councils, implied by the abolition of wage labor in the state. Unfortunately, there is no person alive who could complete this book or write a full substitute for it, who has not just the breadth of knowledge necessary, but the irreplaceable personal experience of the 20th century working class movement. But one can hope that the increasingly apparent need for the abolition of private property capitalism in the West, in the quote West, and the party state system in the quote East, will produce new generations of socialists that will carry on the theoretical and practical struggle to which Paul wished this book to summons up. Meanwhile, it has seemed to me immensely worthwhile to publish the book, even in its unfinished state. Paul characteristically wrote and rewrote draft after draft. In this case, his conception of the book changed after he had written the first part. What had begun as a critique of post-Keynesian economics turned into a more ambitious project. He continued writing, planning to rewrite the work as a whole when he had completed a draft. In doing this, he would undoubtedly have changed it very much, not just stylistically, but also the rearrangement and even alteration of content. The text here published is essentially the text Paul wrote. I edited all of his manuscripts from Marx and Keynes on. For the most part, this meant catching grammatical and semantic slips, although it also sometimes suggests rearrangements of material. I proceeded in the same fashion in editing this book, although in this case Paul could not make the final decision on what suggested changes to adopt. The second essay was much rearranged. To clarify the course of the arrangement, the second half of the manuscript was reorganized into a larger number of shorter essays. This is the first book that Paul wished to dedicate. Marinus van der Lubbe, the man who burned the Reichstag in early 1933, was a member of the Dutch group of international communists. In January 1934, Paul published an article exposing the Third International's attempts to portray van der Lubbe as a Nazi agent, even as the Nazis portrayed him as a communist agent. Sorry, there's a footnote here, or an endnote. And you know how I feel about endnotes. Terrible. I hate endnotes more than I hate capitalism. Let me find this fucking section. Where the hell am I? 306. Okay, it's just like it's just a reference. It's just a citation of like a newspaper from Germany. Anyway, van der Lubbe, Paul wrote, quote, saw how fascism was developing in Germany and how the labor parties did nothing to oppose it, ... On the eve of the fascist seizure of political power, the workers' leaders had nothing to advise but the fraud of parliamentary activity. In protest against this swindle, van der Lubbe set the Reichstag on fire, as a sign that it was not voting but revolution that was needed, ... Van der Lubbe is no Nazi agent, but a class-conscious worker to whom the sympathies of the revolutionary proletariat are due, end quote. One could hardly appeal to a revolutionary proletariat today, but by invoking the memory of Marinus van der Lubbe, I believe, Paul meant to remind us that at a moment like this, when capitalism is making good on its promise of economic collapse and threatens nuclear war and ecocidal catastrophe to boot, the limits of reform indicate the need both for a radical critique of the system's ideological bases and a revolutionary abolition of the realities they reflect. Paul Mattick, Jr. Okay, so that's the end of the foreword. Now we're on to the introduction. And the first part of the book is titled Marxism and Bourgeois Economics. Introduction. Insofar as the criticism of political economy represents a class, it can, according to Marx, quote, only represent that class whose vocation in history is the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production and the final abolition of all classes, the proletariat, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. In Marx's view, political economy was the theoretical expression of the rising capitalist society, which found nothing contradictory in the specific class relations that made its own development possible. The critique of political economy focused exactly on the contradictions inherent in capital production in both theoretical and practical terms. The practical critique remained, at first, the actual struggle between labor and capital over wages and profits within the framework of capitalist production relations, but this struggle implied and expressed a definite developmental trend of capitalism, pointing in the direction of its eventual dissolution. To lay bare this trend was the function of the theoretical critique of political economy. Just as the proletariat opposed the bourgeoisie, so Marx confronted bourgeois economic theory, not in order to develop bourgeois economic theory or to improve bourgeois economic theory, but to destroy its apparent validity and finally, with the abolition of capitalism, overcome it altogether. Whereas the actual class struggle within capitalism was still, quote, political economy, end quote, albeit from the standpoint of the working class. The critique of bourgeois theory anticipated the end of political economy and therewith the end of the society in which its criticism constitutes a necessary part of the proletarian fight for emancipation. Marx's critique of political economy is both an imminent criticism of bourgeois economic theory, made by showing that there is no connection between the theory's assumptions and the conclusions drawn from those assumptions, and a fundamental criticism which maintains that by assuming its own economic relations to be natural and unchangeable, the whole of bourgeois economic theory fails and must fail to comprehend its own society, thereby condemning itself to misapprehend its own development as well as to misconceive its state of being at any particular time. For Marx, bourgeois political economy was incapable of being the theory of its own practice and could serve only as an ideology to safeguard the social conditions of its existence. With regard to the past, it was true, of course, that bourgeois economic theory was the expression of the bourgeoisie's own class struggle within and against feudal society, and to that extent was able to see in the development of production and the productivity of labor the vehicle for social change and the basis of capital accumulation. The classic labor theory of value emerged together with the rise of the bourgeoisie, which considered itself a progressive class because it fostered the increase of the wealth of nations. But with its consolidation as a new ruling class, the bourgeoisie found its early insight into the social labor process quite embarrassing, for it was now confronted by a working class that challenged capitalism on the strength of its own labor-based theory of production by demanding more or all of the social product. From then on, it was for the bourgeoisie, quote, no longer a question whether this theorem or that was true, but whether it was useful to capital or harmful, expedient or inexpedient, politically dangerous or not. In place of disinterested inquirers, there were hired prize fighters. In place of genuine scientific research, the bad conscience and the evil intent of apologetic. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. If you listen to the video that I have on this channel by Michael Heinrich about the fetishism of commodities and its secret, he criticizes this passage from Marx insofar as he thinks that the bourgeoisie were not Heinrich argues that, for one, there was apologetic economists prior to the rise of the working labor movement, or like prior to like when the book was Capital was published, prior to the mid 19th century, but also that that post Marx economics was not merely apologetics, or did not merely have or didn't have any kind of scientific merit whatsoever. Obviously, a lot of it is, and a lot of economic commentators are precisely that, but not completely speaking, totally. Not in a strict sense can you just say, it's not Marxist, so it's apologetics. It's basically what Heinrich says. But this isn't a Heinrich piece, this is a Mattick piece, so moving on. Marx spoke thus of two different schools of political economy. The, quote, classical, extending from Adam Smith to David Ricardo, and, quote, vulgar economy, end quote, which saw its sole purpose in the justification of the capitalist status quo. Whereas there was a necessary connection between classical theory and Marx's critique of political economy, this congruity dissipated with the further development of bourgeois theory, to be totally lost with the rise of the subjective theory of value and the restriction of economics to the study of price and market relations. The connection between Marx and the classics does not, however, imply an identity between the bourgeois and the Marxian value concepts, but merely refers to the common recognition that it is labor that bestows value upon commodities. The classical theory was not just a weaker version of Marx's theory, but a different theory altogether, because the classical value theory had failed, quote, to solve the riddle of surplus value. There's just a side note for myself, there's a bit of a problem with this, is not just that we failed to solve the riddle of surplus value, but failed to explain the value form, right? That's one of the to be used fancy words, parts of Marx's dialectical approach, is that you can't just find the social content of value, but why that social content is necessarily represented in the form of value and must be represented in the form of a thing, must be represented, that social content must be captured in a commodity, in a separate commodity via exchange. So there's a degree to which Marx not only, I think what Mattick's saying here is absolutely true, but just to add to the other thing, that's another thing that people say, is that Marx, is that economics failed classical economics, representing Ricardo, failed to analyze the specific form of commodity production, and took exchange relations and commodity production for granted. Wasn't merely limited to its inability to explain surplus value. And I think that's why, and I think you can, I'm not an expert on Ricardo, but I think you can use a pretty standard Ricardian theory of value to explain surplus value, but maybe I'm wrong about that. The other thing that I was going to say, since I'm thinking out loud, is that this precise historical context that Marx's development, the early Marx's critique of political economy, which, the big publication, of course, was Capital. Obviously, a contribution to the critique of political economy was already published in 1859, but 1867, Capital comes out, and that whole period is simultaneously with Marx developing his critique of political economy, the classical economy. There's another critique of classical political economy coming from the newly developing marginalist school, which is developing at precisely the same time. And so, due to that kind of, there's like a historical reason, not a good historical reason, but there's a due to the fact that there was this break between marginalism and classical political economy, and Marx viewing labor being, or a particular type of labor, abstract, socially necessary labor, representing the content of value, that Marx generally gets lumped in with the classical economics Smith Ricardo. Anyway, sorry for gassing on. I'm just so lonely. Just kidding. I'm not lonely. It's also important to note that last quote, the classical theory was not just a weaker version of Marx's value theory, but a different theory altogether, because the classical value theory, quote, failed to solve the riddle of surplus value, end quote. That quote is not from Marx, it's actually from Engels in Capital Volume 2. So that's relevant. Marx's theory of value and surplus value, implying the exploitation of labor by capital, could only find an antagonistic reception in bourgeois economics, and was either totally ignored or, quote, refuted by simultaneous disowning of classical economy in the shift from, quote, political economy to, quote, economics, a positive science that concerns itself exclusively with exchange relations, apart from any consideration of the social production relations on which they are based. This, of course, was as it should be, even though Marx himself voiced some disappointment over the meager response his work elicited among bourgeois economists. His economic writings, particularly Capital, became, in Friedrich Engels' rather inappropriate phrase, quote, the Bible of the working class, end quote, and as such found only derision in bourgeois economic doctrine. Quote, Marxism, another unfortunate expression, was recognized as the revolutionary ideology of the working class, which stood in unbridgeable opposition to the capitalist class and to the set of ideas justifying its existence. How things have changed since then. Not only has capitalism undergone extensive modifications through its own development, which have found their reflection in bourgeois economic theory, Marxism too has altered its character in the course of the shifting fortunes of capitalist society. The successful expansion of capital and the amelioration of conditions of the laboring class led to spreading doubt regarding the validity of Marx's critical theory. This doubt drew its strength not so much from an imminent criticism of this theory, as from its confrontation with an empirical reality that seemed to contradict Marx's expectations with respect to capitalism's future. Marxism became an increasingly more ambiguous doctrine, serving purposes different from those initially contemplated. This change was still in line with the Marxian conception that changes in material conditions will alter the consciousness of men, but this must now be applied to the reception of Marxism itself. It lost its revolutionary implications and became the false ideology of a non-revolutionary practice. The accommodation of socialist theory to the realities of the unfolding capitalist system was brought about through the incorporation of bourgeois economic ideas into the framework of Marxism. Until recently, however, there was no reciprocal response on the part of the bourgeoisie, for, quote, Marx was not merely the author of a scientific treatise, but also the great leader of the socialist movement. He was therefore a person whose conclusions were so unacceptable to economists that few of them had any will or patience to endeavor to profit by the aspects of his work which might have been serviceable to them. So that as far as theoretical political economy is concerned, the influence of Marx was, for a time at least, almost altogether indefinite. End quote. And that quote's from W.C. Mitchell, Types of Economic Theory. This attitude was of an exemplary consistency, which cannot be said for the position taken by the proponents of, quote, Marxist economics. As classical economy degenerated into vulgar economy, a type of, quote, vulgar Marxism arose which tried to avail itself of the, quote, progress being made in the, quote, science of economics, end quote. The marginal utility theory seemed to be a closer approximation to actual price formation than was Marx's derivation of prices from labor-time values. The exchange of one theory for the other was deemed the more desirable because the marginal principle was not restricted to capitalist exchange relations, but could be regarded as a universal and therefore neutral principle valid for all times and all societies. So there was, after all, quote, economic laws, end quote, that could be appreciated by friend and foe alike, thus breaking down the harsh dividing line between opposing social systems. In contrast to Marx, modern, quote, Marxists tend to see in bourgeois economic theory more than just apologetics, inasmuch as it also serves the practical needs of economic policy. Quote, if bourgeois economists objectively investigate some aspects of the economy and thereby determine the results of one or another policy, they perform a useful function for capital, quite aside from their simultaneous ideological defense of the system. Indeed, of merely pointing to the apologetic nature of bourgeois theory, Marxists should consider and evaluate its practical consequences and recognize the double function of the economists. End quote. H. Meissner, Bürgerliche Ökonomie in modernen Kapitalismus, published in 1967. This concession on the part of, quote, Marxism has found some reciprocation in the bourgeois camp. Attempts have been made to overcome the strict opposition of bourgeois economy to Marxism, in order to utilize some of the findings of the latter for the, quote, enrichment, end quote, of bourgeois theory. The two-pronged endeavor to reconcile, at least to some extent, the historical antagonism between Marxism and bourgeois economic theory reflected a crisis in Marxism as well as in bourgeois theory. While the crisis of Marxism is a long spun-out affair, dating back to the turn of the century, the crisis in bourgeois theory came together with the Great Depression in the wake of the First World War, which demonstrated the falsity of neoclassical price and market theory. The latter, however, found some sort of resurrection through its Keynesian modifications. Although it had to be admitted that the assumed equilibrium mechanism of the market was not operative, it was now asserted that it could be made so with a little governmental help. The disequilibrium of insufficient demand could be straightened out by a government-induced production for, quote, public consumption, end quote, not only under static assumptions but also under conditions of economic growth with appropriate monetary and fiscal policies. According to the, quote, neo-Keynesian synthesis, end quote, a market economy enriched by government planning would overcome capitalism's susceptibility to crisis and depression and allow, in principle, for a steady growth of capitalist production. The long economic upswing after World War II seemed to substantiate these expectations, but despite the continuing availability of governmental interventions, a new crisis followed this period of capital expansion, as it always had in the past. The clever, quote, fine-tuning, end quote, of the economy and the, quote, trade-off between inflation and unemployment did not prevent a new economic decline, manifesting itself in growing unemployment, with and despite an increasing rate of inflation. The crisis and the means designed to cope with it proved to be equally detrimental to capital. Apart from the fact that the actual crisis conditions brought the crisis of bourgeois economic theory to a head, its long-standing impoverishment through its increasing formalization via marginalism and general equilibrium theory raised many doubts in the heads of even of academic economists. The current questioning of all the assumptions of neoclassical theory and its Keynesian offspring has led to a half-hearted return to classical political economy, most forcefully represented by the so-called neo-Ricardians. Marx himself is frequently looked upon as a Ricardian economist, and as such finds increasing favor among bourgeois theoreticians, who now attempt to integrate his, quote, pioneer work, end quote, into their own speciality, the science of economics. Meanwhile, just as the return from economics to political economy is in some quarters adjudged a progressive step within the field of economic theory, so the adoption of some of the analytical methods evolved by bourgeois economics is hailed in the, quote, Marxist camp as pointing to important similarities with respect to the problems to be solved and the tools available for their solution in both capitalism and socialism, thus indicating that there are general economic laws valid for all societies. Strange as it may seem, the new interest in Marxism in general, and in, quote, Marxist economics, end quote, in particular, does not stem from a revived Marxist labor movement, but pertains almost exclusively to the academic world, which is essentially the world of the middle class. An enormous outpouring of Marxist literature is occurring at a time when the labor movement, not to speak of the workers as a class, finds itself at the historically lowest ebb of its emancipatory aspirations. Quote, Marxology, end quote, has become a new profession, and there are Marxist branches in, quote, radical economics and other social science disciplines. This academization of Marxism goes hand in hand with the adoption of the term, quote, Marxism by national and social movements that have not the remotest connection with the problems that were Marx's concern. All this may imply no more than a passing intellectual fad, but even as such it bears evidence of the twilight state of modern society, which is no longer the capitalism of old, and short of a proletarian revolution cannot be transformed into socialism. Moreover, quote, Marxism, in its apparently, quote, realized form, in the self-styled, quote, socialist countries, end quote, seems to offer a way out of the present impasse, or at least suggest the direction in which capitalism must move to solve its crisis problem without sacrificing its social class or production relations. The current preoccupation with Marxism on the part of so-called the current preoccupation with Marxism on the part of social scientists and the, quote, modernization, end quote, of Marxist theory has led to an amalgam of erroneous and contradictory interpretations that becloud more than clarify Marx's intentions and the implications of his theory for capitalist society. Before discussing the various endeavors to integrate Marxism into the body of bourgeois economic theory, or to accommodate the latter to the teachings of Marx, it is thus unavoidable, once again, to start with an exposition of Marx's critique of political economy and to elucidate its true content. Only then will it be possible to demonstrate the wide disparities between Marx's end position and the various misinterpretations it has found in the numerous attempts to bridge the contradiction between Marxism and bourgeois economic theory. Accordingly, what follows proceeds from a presentation of Marx's critique of political economy. In short, a form as possible, as short a form as possible, to a discussion of the different receptions it has found in socialist and bourgeois circles. It will then be possible to evaluate the present state of both bourgeois economics and Marxism, and the relation to one another, and to understand the reasons for their apparent predisposition to converge as a mere reflection of the general crisis of capitalist production. Okay, so that is the end of the forward and introduction to Marxism, Last Refuge of the Bourgeoisie by Paul Mattick. Thank you so much for listening.